Greetings, students, and welcome to the next segment of Walking with Christ through World Literature, this one focusing on post-war and post-colonial literature. The question at the heart of this module's works is, how do I keep faith, or how do I do the right thing when I realize that my identity and my whole world has been shaped by all kinds of traumatic events that I had no control over, maybe that happened before I was born, and yet I've grown up in the middle of this mess that I can't untangle myself from, and it has affected my values, my personality, my impulses, my assumptions, and even prejudices. What do I do? For people growing up in post-colonial nations, nations that had a colonizer come in and take over the landscape and the governmental and economic structures and change the lives of native peoples in that place. Even after the nation gains its independence and becomes post-colonial, this problem remains. You can't unscramble scrambled eggs once they've been scrambled up and cooked. What do I do when I have lost my connections to my native culture? And I'm now this hybrid thing, this, in some senses, a traumatized and victimized people group is my group. What do I do? And even though post-colonialism as a discussion has faded a little bit into the background in our world today, the same problem is still very present and real. How do we do what's right when we are surrounded by all of these complex questions of systemic racism and injustice, the political polarization of our nation and the economic polarization of our world? If I'm a Christian and I grow up at first thinking that everything is great in my Christian community, and then I come to realize that my own church maybe has been deeply shaped by conflicts that happened in the past, maybe 10 years before my life began, or a generation or two back, that people around me are stuck in trenches, fighting a trench warfare with one another, when we've even lost sight of where the conflict originally started. How do we do what's right in this case? Can we just walk away and start over again? Or can we somehow continue to lead a fruitful and a good life in the middle of such a messed up situation? And for many of us on a more personal level, we run into this problem in learning more about our family's history and experiences, our parents, our own childhoods, or trying to put down roots in a new community or in a new workplace. So it's a very present question. And I think that when we look to Jesus for guidance at the spiritual heart of this module's literature, we might think about the tension you see in the Gospels between what it means to be defined by God and what it means to be defined by the existing conflicts of Jesus' world. Take, for example, the Gospel of John. There's this interesting story in John chapter 1 where Jesus is calling some of his first disciples. And one of these guys named Nathaniel approaches. Nathaniel doesn't think that Jesus is going to be anything impressive because of the town where he was brought up, Nazareth. But Jesus sees him coming and says, "Here's a true Israelite in whom is no deceptiveness." Now, I think that this is a moment where Jesus is making a sarcastic joke, because at the time that Jesus is speaking, there are no Israelites unless people are making a political statement by calling themselves Israelites. The nation of Israel had been conquered, and most of the tribes had been annihilated or had just disappeared through intermarriage. Mostly there was just the tribe of Judah left, and Jew or Jewish had become a name for this people group. And yet the people that were the descendants of Israel still really cared about being ruled by God, being ruled by their own government. And so there were people that were fiercely committed to reestablishing Israel's self-government against the Syrian Empire and then against the Roman Empire. And so, you see these stories in the Gospels of Jesus picking a range of different people to follow him, from the redneck fishermen through some very wealthy people that worked for the government, tax collectors, through some people that had a biblical scholarly training, and some zealots. Zealots were those political activists, probably even terrorists or assassins in our modern terms, that were so intent on reestablishing self-rule that they were ready to take up arms and fight and kill. And I am guessing that when Jesus says to Nathanael, "An Israelite in whom is no guile," he's making a reference to that kind of political commitment. The sarcastic part of the joke comes from that name Israel actually coming from Jacob, the forefather of the Israelite people. And Jacob was a trickster. He was full of guile and deceptiveness. Think Loki or Anansi, characters out of mythology that are known for being con artists and deceivers. That's who Jacob was in the Bible for most of his life. And right there, when Jesus talks to this disciple, Nathanael, he's kind of presenting him with a choice. Which world is going to define you? The world of politics and backstabbing, of conflict and violence? Or is your relationship with God going to be the thing that defines you? Jacob's name back in the book of Genesis in the Bible was changed to Israel, and that name changed the meaning of his name changed from the deceiver to he who wrestles with God. It was a fundamental reorienting of where he was drawing his identity from. And if you look through the rest of the Gospel of John, you see that same conflict animating the whole thread of the Gospel. This challenge that Jesus is presenting everybody around him. Are you going to be defined by the post-colonial conflicts of being brought up in a conquered nation under the heel of the Roman government? Are you going to be locked into the politics and the paradigm that entails? Or is there a way to still exist in that world but play by different rules, to be defined by your struggle with God, not your struggle against the Roman Empire? And I hope you'll listen to me carefully. I am not suggesting that to be a Christian in today's world means to be sheerly apolitical. And I'm also definitely not saying that a person, to be faithful, has to take a certain side in the political debates of our day. But I think that this central truth that Jesus teaches us is still so important in our context, that we can exist in these messed up, broken systems that we live in. We can serve in them, can keep faith with our neighbors and with God in them, and yet not be defined by them. That is a constant struggle, and we see one of the works we read in this module just exactly explains the spiritual heart of that problem. This is James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son. Pay close attention to that entire story, but especially the ending, where he says he realized, after coming to terms with his strained legacy of conflict with his own father, and then gaining a better understanding of the racism that had surrounded his father and the racism that he, James, now faced as he entered the adult world. He says, I realized that I was faced with the problem of holding on to two contradictory things at the same time. On the one hand, I could not let the hatred and bitterness that had shaped my entire existence poison me. It would destroy my heart and destroy all the people around me if I let that hatred in. And so I had to reject it, and I had to accept the world as it was given to me and make no judgment of other people, but try to act with grace and humility in the mess I find myself in. But on the other hand, he says, I had to hold on to the opposite belief that we could not excuse the evil going on all around us, that we had to resist it at every possible opportunity. And that holding those two in tension, a kind of a gracious acceptance of the world and a dedication to make the world a better place to the extent that's within our power to do, is where he ends that story. He says, the way my father would explain it would be by quoting the Bible. Choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. The gods of your forefathers, or those ruling the land you are living in, or choose the Lord. I hope that God gives you the wisdom in your own post-colonial or postmodern environment to learn how to keep faith with the Lord and be defined by the identity that He gives.